Welcome back. It's been about 2 hours since we refreshed our starter this morning. I have that here in my mixing bowl. It's grown a bit in volume, looks a little puffy, maybe some signs of air bubbles beneath the surface. That looks great. So gathering the things we need for mix. Got our package of flour, and we're gonna weigh out the water. So for those of you who have a scale, let's go ahead and turn the scale on. Let it zero out. I'm gonna weigh my water into this. So I've got that on there, and I'm gonna tare, which just brings the scale to zero, so I'm not including any weight of my vessel here. And again, I'm using my tea kettle for water. We find that this is an easy way to weigh out water, and we can easily warm it to the temperature we'd like. This is about 85 degrees. So I'm going to weigh out the 265 grams of water. Okay. And for those of you who are working with volume, that works out to about 1 1/8 cup of water. So now I'm gonna bring my bowl out. Let's get that lid off of there. And we're done with this scale. So I'm gonna turn that off. I'm gonna move it out of the way. Let's get our flour opened up while we have clean hands. And just be careful, we got a couple of folds here, but let's make sure we don't lose any flour when we're unfolding it. There we go. So that's ready for us. And now I'm gonna just pour my water straight over our sourdough starter. In this case, it's now, I'm gonna call it a sourdough 11, because this starter is bound for making bread dough and eventually is gonna get baked, and that's gonna kill the sourdough. So a little bit of lingo there. Starter, I would consider separate from 11 in that it's never going to get baked and therefore killed. So our starter, we always want to reserve in the fridge or on the counter, and we're going to refresh it so that we always have an active and healthy culture to then build 11, which we did this morning. And now our 11 is here. We're going to mix it with this water. And like I said earlier, it's bound for baking and therefore no longer going to be viable sourdough starter because it's going to be delicious bread. So you can see that my leaven is floating. That's a good indicator that there's plenty of gas buildup in there, and it's gonna kind of rise to the top. It doesn't need to float, but if it does, that's just a sign of healthy activity. So I'm gonna get in here with my hand. If you want to use the scraper, that's a great tool as well. I like to get in by hand. I can break up bits, massage the flour and try to hydrate, but right now we're just trying to dissolve this starter into the water. Kind of use my fingers like this, quick circles, works a bit like a whisk and doesn't slosh around too much. So I don't feel any obvious clumps of the starter, the leaven in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab my flour. I'm just gonna dump this bag straight into there. And you can go ahead and reference the recipe that we provided to know exactly how much flour is in there. We have two types of flour. It's a bread flour, which is a sifted flour that's high protein and gonna build a nice strong loaf so that we bake up nice and tall. And then we have some high protein whole wheat flour. And that's why our classic loaf always had a bit of that cream color in the crumb. And we like the added nutrition and flavor of whole grain. So now I'm going in there and I'm just using my fingers, kind of a similar whisk, but a little bit more of a massaging. I'm just trying to work that dry flour into the dough and incorporate everything. So I'm slowly turning the bowl, using the tips of my fingers to scrape the side of the bowl, get that crusty stuff off the side. If you're using your scraper, you do the same with the scraper. the rubber scraper. It's starting to come together here. Make sure we scrape the bottom too. That's an easy spot to miss. We want to try to get as much of that crusty stuff off the side and the bottom as possible, because as our dough develops, if that crusty spot stays there, it's just gonna lend the dough to want to stick to that spot. And it's just gonna make things a little more difficult down the line. So it's starting to come together here. I've got a little bit of dry flour here, so I'm just gonna make sure I incorporate that. And now I'm starting to, hopefully you can see that, I'm starting to grab a bit, pull it up, and just fold it into the middle. And so it's gonna, what it's gonna do is it's gonna evenly spread the hydrated and non-hydrated flour. And hopefully we get a nice even mix. And that's kind of about where I wanna be. I don't see any obvious dry bits. It's still rough. It's what they call a shaggy dough. And we're not looking for gluten development at this stage. We're just looking to get all the dry flour incorporated. And I've got quite a bit of dough in my hand, so that's where this scraper can come in handy. Scrape it off, and I'm gonna do my best to plop it on top of the dough here so that it can continue to be a part of our dough and end up in our delicious loaf of bread in the morning. Trying to scrape all the bits in between my fingers. This might be where some of you would rather use a tool instead of your hand. I just think it's fun to get hands-on. So for those of you who like getting messy and hands-on, please do so. For those of you who'd rather use the tool, please do that. There's no right or wrong, better or worse. This is just my preference. There's a little bit of crusty stuff around the side. I'm gonna do my best to scrape that down, get it to be a part of this dough ball here at the bottom. And that's about it. So let's go ahead and put a cover on our dough. And again, place that in a warm corner of the kitchen. We're gonna let it rest at this stage for about another hour. And this period between mix and the next step is considered autolyse. It's a French term, but what it describes is the period between mixing and adding salt. And so we withhold the salt for a period of time because salt can inhibit the flour's ability to absorb the water. Salt really likes to grab water, as some of you may know. You can cure meats or dry things by packing them with salt, and the salt really sucks the water out. So by withholding the salt during this first hour, we're giving those tiny granules of flour, which is just tiny pieces of wheat, their best chance at really pulling all the moisture within themselves. And that's gonna give us a better feel for the dough later on. And it's gonna be a lot easier on the belly because those things are fully hydrated. Imagine trying to eat like halfway cooked rice. That's just on like a microscopic level. Those little granules of flour in this analogy would be the grains of rice. And if they're not fully hydrated, it's just gonna be a little bit tougher on our bellies. And yeah, so here we go. We're gonna wait an hour for autolyse. Check back in an hour. Thanks, guys.